Welcome to another episode of All Queued Up. I think this is episode 10 now.
Episode 10, yeah.
It's 10 episodes in, and it still feels as fresh as it did day one. But, guys, thank you for being here. If you're new to the show, my name is Greg Dietz. I host primarily because I talk too much. But with me as my co-host, as always, is Josh Fisher.
Hey, everybody.
My Twitter handle is @ChubRockGeek. Josh, what is your Twitter handle?
@NSabanur1976.
There you go. All right, so if you're new to the show, what we do here is we watch an entire episode, an entire show on a internet streaming service, a la Netflix, Hulu, Amazon Prime, YouTube Red. You have it. If it's something that's on the internet, we watch and review it. We also discuss it. That's why it's a discuss and review podcast. Anywho, because we do this, we also spoil the hell out of every show. So if there's a show that you want to check out without it being spoiled, go watch it and then come back and listen to our opinion on it.
Yeah, some shows are just simply too hard to talk about without being spoiled.
There is that. Also, I created the show because I wanted to talk about shows with somebody. So there was that main reason. But yes. I think that's the reason all podcasts get started, is for a simple reason, and if they kind of go further than that, that's great. But I wanted to find somebody that I could have meaningful conversations about these amazing shows that we get to watch. So that's, that was my whole point. And if you guys enjoy the show, thank you so much. Again, there are a myriad of ways to find us online, and I'm going to let Josh run all of those down right now.
Well, you can find us on Google Play, iTunes, Stitcher, Podbean, and we also have a website. It is allqueueduppodcast.wordpress.com. We have a Facebook page, which you just facebook.com/allqueueduppodcast. We have a Twitter account where you can tweet at us, which is @queueduppodcast. And let's see, am I leaving anything out? I don't think so. We also have an Instagram account, but we haven't started advertising anything on there yet. So once we do, we'll put that out there for you as well. But if you want to email us, we have an email account, which is allqueueduppodcast@gmail.com.
I also want to throw out there that we have a Discord account, which you can go in there, and that's another place where you can suggest new shows for us to watch, or whatever. Like, that's a good way to contact us, because that's how we primarily communicate, is through Discord. So,
you know what? I left out the new YouTube channel since our last episode.
Yeah. That's right.
We created a YouTube channel. It is just simply called All Queued Up Podcast, and what we're doing is uploading our past episodes that we have previously recorded and setting image files to them, trying to relate specific scenes from whatever show or movie we're talking about to make it a little more relevant, to give some, say if you want a visual cue to go along with your podcast listening, you have that.
Exactly, there you go.
But it does take a few hours, so I'm still loading the past episodes. So,
yeah,
hopefully by the time this one airs, we'll be all caught up.
Which will be great for you, because then it won't be as much work uploading episodes for a while there.
Yeah,
you'll get bored not having work to do, Josh.
I'll have other projects, believe me.
But today's episode is going to be a fascinating one. One that Josh and I are extremely excited about. So, first we get to talk about a show that we both watched actually a little while ago, called The Toys That Made Us. But before we start discussing that show, the other rad thing that's going to happen right after this, it'll sound a little different because we're going to record on a different format entirely. But Josh and I will be interviewing the creator of the show, Brian Volk-Weiss. It's going to be an awesome interview just because the guy not only made the show, but he also works for Netflix, and we're going to ask him a ton of questions about that. on top of making the show, how to film a documentary. Like, we have a myriad of questions, guys. So after the review, come back and listen to that because it's going to be a very, very fun interview. But right now, we need to start talking about the toys that made us. So, Josh, I'm going to hit the timer, and I want you to run down the synopsis of the show, please.
Oh, okay. Give me just one moment here. And, almost came ill-prepared. Oh, my goodness.
Let me go ahead and stop the timer, and then get it going again when you're ready.
Oh, you're good.
Okay.
All right. Well, The Toys That Made Us is basically a documentary series that was released on December 22nd. It is an 8-episode season, but it's broken up into 2 parts. So right now, only the first 4 parts are out. But what it is just an in-depth look at some of the most iconic toy franchises. And they discuss the rise and fall, if there is a fall, in these multi-million and in some cases billion-dollar creations. The first 4 episodes they look at, they start with Star Wars, they move into Barbie, on to He-Man, and then the 4th episode is G.I. Joe. And 3 of those franchises were always near and dear to me growing up as a kid, and still are in a lot of ways. But I thought it was fascinating because they actually talk to designers and sculptors and writers.
If the person, if the person's, so I said, if the person's still alive and can be interviewed, they were interviewed if they had any kind of relation to making the toy.
Oh yeah, it was great. It was just so fascinating to watch. Honestly, there was not a bad episode of this that, I'm a giant toy fanatic. I mean, it's briefly been mentioned on here before, but I have a pretty extensive collection. So, something that I get to talk about, my love of documentaries and my love of toys merged into one, so it's kind of cool.
Yeah, I didn't know, like, Josh had watched the show before I did, because I remember we were talking about shows to do, and we were on Twitch streaming something, and one of the viewers was just like, you need to watch Toys That Made Us, and Josh immediately was like, I absolutely have, and it's a great show, and so I was like, you know what, I want to check this show out, and so we had both technically watched this show outside of preparing to talk about it for the podcast, but through the course of events, now we're going to be talking about it, obviously. The only toy I can honestly say that I was attached to in the 4 episodes of the show, in any way, shape, or form, was
Barbie.
Star. Yes, Barbie. No, Star Wars. But here's the other thing: I was born in '83, right after Jedi had come out. Actually, I was born right before Jedi came out, technically, right? Yes.
Yeah, it came out the first weekend of May.
That's what I thought. Yeah. So I was maybe a month old.
Yeah, I had just turned 7 years old a couple weeks before it came out, so I remember seeing it in theaters with my cousins.
See, that's rad. Like, I don't have that memory, even though Star Wars is like easily my favorite franchise. But I did grow up with the toys. When I was very young, I'd say late 80s, early 90s, there were still toys being produced. And I knew friends that had them. I had a few. My brothers had a few. I mean, there was definitely Star Wars toys in this house. And, I still have an R2-D2 from when I was a kid that I'm pointing at that you can't see. What was so fascinating to me about the documentary was it didn't just talk about the toys, and it didn't just talk about like common information that everyone knew, the cardboard set. It went into like, my first thought was like, okay, well, Jedi ended in '83, or Jedi came out in '83, and I'm sure they sold toys for a couple of years after that. But what about the late '80s and early '90s where there was no Star Wars? There just wasn't anything Star Wars. Like, what happened? And they went into that, and they talked about how Kenner was just like, we aren't making money on this. And I think, was it Mattel that bought it?
No, it was Hasbro that bought them.
Hasbro. Thank you. Sorry. Yeah, Hasbro bought them. And I was very intrigued by how that whole process went down. Like,
it actually,
because I didn't know any of that.
Yeah, Hasbro buying Kenner out kind of put a damper on the G.I. Joe product line as well, because, you know, for the longest time, 82 to 94, G.I. Joe was Hasbro's breadwinner. And then the sales started declining and slumping because they had shifted people around. They bought Kenner. And they shifted those guys in the G.I. Joe department around, as Kirk Bazigian talks about in the G.I. Joe documentary. And, of course, you know, in 1995, what happens? Star Wars toys are re-released for the first time in 10 years in stores. And people, myself included, went batshit looking for them. Because
I don't doubt it, yeah. What, in 75, you were 9?
No, I was not even conceived in 75.
I mean 85, sorry.
85, yeah. 85, yeah, I was 9.
Sorry, my bad.
Oh, no, it's funny.
Well, what you're talking about right now, before you continue, I think is so fascinating about this whole show. And I'm really excited about the next 4 episodes, because I'm sure that we're going to hear more intertwining things. But there was a lot of moments where, like, you know, during the Star Wars one, they would talk about how other products affected how Star Wars sold or didn't sell. And then you get to G.I. Joe, and it's like, oh, He-Man kind of hurt G.I. Joe. And you're like, what the fuck? Like, it's really, really cool how they kind of intertwine with each other on a competitive level.
Oh, yeah.
Like, that was so interesting to me. That was so cool to me that they would do that. And I remember during the He-Man one, there was a moment where they talked about, like, when they brought out She-Ra. And then they go back to the lady they were talking to about Barbie from the Barbie episode, and she was like, yeah, we hated She-Ra.
No, they loved She-Ra. That was the thing. They were both brands at Mattel. You know, Barbie.
Who said they didn't like? Somebody said they didn't like something.
It was a lot of the guys that worked on the He-Man line that didn't like the fact that they started the She-Ra line. They felt that, one of them in particular felt that it demasculated He-Man and it hurt the line's sales.
Well, yeah, I remember
that. But that's not true at all. Yeah, there were a few instances of, I knew girls that I lived next to and went to school with that loved playing He-Man and everything, and they were just jazzed as hell when She-Ra toys came out. But what led to He-Man's downfall, because once it debuted in late 81 and early 2000, or late 81 and early 1982, He-Man started beating the pants off of Star Wars sales. G.I. Joe debuted later in 82. And those were the top 3 lines right there. And then you had Barbie, you know, for girls' toys. But those were the top 3 sellers in boys' toy lines. And He-Man stayed on top, I think, in 83, 84, and 85, maybe even 86. Star Wars was gone by 86, but G.I. Joe and He-Man were the top 2, along with Transformers by that point. I mean, sales were ridiculous.
Well, what's so fascinating, I'm going to briefly bring this up, is the next 4 episodes are on Transformers, Hello Kitty, Star Trek, and Lego. What I'm interested in is how Hello Kitty affected anything in North America. That's what I want to hear.
And, you know, I've heard it argued that Hello Kitty is not so much a toy as it is just a brand.
Well, yeah,
so that'll be a fascinating...
Sanrio? I can't remember the company that makes it, but it's something like that. I'm close. I know I'm close.
I have very limited knowledge of Hello Kitty, so this will be my main educator when that drops.
Well, that's what I'm so fascinated about, is that, you know, we talk, you know, when you watch the Barbie one and how they marketed to girls, and that's how they were able to sell it. Like, parents were just like, wait, this is teaching girls how to be adults. I'm in. how to be homemakers or whatever.
Oh, that was the big selling point. Yeah,
that was absolutely the big selling point. But as the 70s hit, girls can do everything, which was great because it helped. Anyway, point I'm getting at is Hello Kitty is very much a baby or little girl brand. And I'm fascinated to know exactly how that affected North America as a whole when it comes to sales. Because we know that Transformers is popular in Japan. We know that. So
they're popular in this house.
Well, they're popular in the United States, clearly. But they were not originally a Japanese product, even though you look at Transformers, you're like, boy, that seems very Japanese.
Well, all of the molds were used. They were already pre-existing molds that were sold by multiple companies in Japan.
Spoilers.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
I'm joking. I don't. It's not a big deal.
But yeah.
Because I'm just the point is after watching these 4 episodes and seeing how sales from He-Man affected Star Wars, or how G.I. Joe was, canned at a certain point and then came back, and how it affected sales of other toys, and that whole thing was so interesting and fascinating to me. I'm really curious how, did Transformers affect the sales of G.I. Joe?
Oh, absolutely.
I don't know that stuff. That was the stuff that I really, really dug about this documentary.
Oh, okay.
In every episode, that's
also something I have
to get at.
That's also something that I have to take into account because I am such a toy nerd. With the Star Wars, He-Man, and G.I. Joe properties, I knew a good 90 to 98% of the information that was in those documentaries just because.
Really?
Yeah.
I knew maybe 25%.
There was now, as for a casual viewer, somebody who's like, "Oh, I remember having that growing up." This is going to be just so informative and information packed. I still loved it. It didn't take away from my detractment at all. Don't get me wrong, but I knew a lot of the history just because. Well, I've done research and I've done articles in the past for another website. Researching the history of G.I. Joe and researching the history of Transformers and other properties in Star Wars.
Well, I'll give you an example of something I knew and then didn't know when they were talking about G.I. Joe. I knew that G.I. Joe started off as a post-World War II toy.
Mm-hmm. Very first action figure ever marketed for boys.
Right. I knew that was their way to sell a doll to boys, was by calling it an action figure.
Yep. But for customs purposes, they are classified as dolls.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, sure. However, going into the revamp in the 80s, I knew nothing of that. Oh. No information was in my head about that. So, and the way, just to clarify here, the way that they make it look and the way that everything is done and edited and filmed properly in this documentary keeps your attention tenfold.
Yes. It's like, okay, we could just talk about our board meetings that we had doing pitches for new product lines, or we can do some reenactment. And those were fun. Those were really fun. And I know in the G.I. Joe episode they clearly used actors in reenactment, but I wasn't sure because the Star Wars episode opens up with the one executive from Kenner at the lot of Lucasfilm when they're shooting. And I'm like, okay, is this just a reenactment or is that actual footage? I couldn't tell. But it was very well done. But it was just... I really loved the Barbie episode.
Yeah, that one was probably the one I knew the least about. I knew maybe 2% of the information told in that.
I didn't know a lot about, the backstory of Barbie. I just knew she was the first doll that wasn't like a baby doll. She was the first fashion accessory doll and everything. I didn't know Barbie's lewd inspiration. Which was amazing. Yeah. But I also didn't realize that Barbie from its inception and all throughout its current history, it's mostly been headed up by women. I mean, yeah, men have worked on the line too, but it's mainly always been worked on by women, and it makes sense because they're aimed at girls. So
right. What's so fascinating about these 4 episodes, by the way, is that like Star Wars was just like, okay, it's a movie. Obviously, they got to sell toys, so let's get those toys out as fast as possible. We makeshift some stuff. We what do they call it when they start cutting pieces together?
Kit bashing.
And then kit bashing. Thank you.
Yeah.
And then like Barbie and G.I. Joe kind of have a similar arc to their story, up until like when G.I. Joe stopped selling and then came back in the 80s. Like that's different, but. In regards to like it being original property and trying to sell it to kids, but in a very specific way. However, He-Man had a super fascinating origin, where basically they were just like, we need a toy. We just need to make something that sells.
Yeah, because Mattel, even though Barbie was on top of the world, they didn't have boy toys. They didn't have action figures. And Star Wars was kicking the shit out of them. And they're like, we need, something that can... The head of Kenner at the time says, we need something that'll kill Star Wars. Oh, well, thanks, no pressure. And
yeah.
Something that I always thought was fascinating is there are always, in a successful toy line, a conglomerate of people that have input in creating these characters and lines. And it's always, oh, well, so-and-so is credited as creator of this. And no, I created this. It's very similar to comic books in that regard. Artists and writers, the longest time there was the whole, okay, Stan Lee created this. Well, Jack Kirby brought it to life, and it's like, can't they just be co-creators? But in this, it's like, okay, Roger Sweet coined the term He-Man. He came up with the concept of He-Man. Mark Taylor came up with the actual aesthetic designs and created some of the characters to combat He-Man on his own. But then you had the other guys that came up with other aspects. So it's like they say, it's a stew, and there are many chefs, and it all has to come together, but it's just fascinating how all that works.
Yeah, there's an old phrase that says, like, you don't want to make a horse a camel, which basically means that, like, if there's too many cooks in the kitchen, you're going to make a bad stew. But in regards to these toys, that was never the case.
No, you needed all those people.
Yeah. That's another fascinating angle. One of my favorite moments, by the way, that I just absolutely adored was it Big Jim is what they had before He-Man?
Big Jim was a boys action figure toy line in the early 70s that they tried to compete with G.I. Joe and other boy toy lines, but when Star Wars came out, it just absolutely crushed any and all Big Jim sales.
Right. So because Big Jim was such a huge flop, when trying to come up with a writable thing for He-Man, they just repainted the tigers from Big Jim.
Yeah.
And that became Battle Cat, and I couldn't have loved that more.
Yeah, it's because, we needed a third vehicle, but we ran out of tooling money, and we only had enough money to produce 2. And that's when they, wait a minute, we've got a tiger from Big Jim. And the one guy was like, Big Jim was a 9.5-inch tall figure. These are 5.5 inches tall. The one guy was like, it's not going to work. It's not going to scale. They're just like, just do it. I don't care. But it's as big as a horse. And they're like, so put a saddle on it. And then they did, and boom, Battle Cat was born. He-Man, just the way a lot of the early stuff on, they said, we were just like throwing spaghetti at the wall and seeing what stuck. And early on, everything stuck.
Yeah, it was that I couldn't have loved more. It was so fascinating to hear the different perspectives from the different people who'd worked on He-Man, When it came to Barbie, it was like there was always people recycling through. When it came to G.I. Joe, it was like, you remember this franchise from a long time ago? Well, let's bring it back. And with Star Wars, it was just like, how can we make this as fast as possible? And but He-Man was the most original thing out of the four to me on the origin and creation of it. Like, it wasn't based off of anything. There wasn't a need for it outside of like, we want to make a toy that boys will feel powerful for having. So there's just like that was incredibly interesting and fascinating to me, and how they made that. And
Star Wars was a game changer, though. I mean, because
absolutely
back then, when you go into a Toys R Us or a Walmart or a Target now, what are the toys that you see that are the most popular ones? Movie tie-ins. Back in the 70s, with the rare exception, you didn't have movies that had toys. Mego produced some Planet of the Apes figures back in the day, and there was the Star Trek figures in Mego, but other than that, you didn't have a lot of movie licenses. And that's why Kenner got such a good deal on producing that line, because nobody wanted to take a chance on it. They thought, this movie is going to suck. And, licensing fees back then, I believe Mattel in their He-Man documentary said they were paying about $4 million per film property for the rights to make the toys, and weren't even making that $4 million back.
Yeah.
So that's why they decided to produce their own, and how they came up with He-Man. And in their first year, they promised sales of $13 million and made $38 million. So almost double, what they promised. So
right. Well, let's go ahead and wrap it up. Let's give our recommendations. I'll go first, since I'm sure, Josh, you're going to have a much more interesting recommendation to listen to, since you have more knowledge about it than I do. From a decent layman's perspective, it's not that I don't own toys or that I don't love toys, because I genuinely do. I just never really thought to look into the information that was given in the documentary. And upon watching all 4 episodes, I couldn't have been more fascinated. I probably could have been, but they can only do what they can do with. So, but it was funny. It was fascinating. It was interesting. Like, I'm super excited for the next 4 episodes, and I hope the show continues, because there are a plethora of toys that they could dive into and make multiple episodes of this show. Which, let's hope we can ask Brian that tomorrow. But the point is that, I guess I shouldn't have said tomorrow, next segment. Anyway, regardless, I could not recommend the show enough. Even if you aren't interested in the toys being talked about, even if you aren't interested in the properties being talked about, it's fascinating to see the behind-the-scenes stuff that most people probably don't know. I am included in that didn't know. So, I highly, highly, highly recommend it. Definitely check it out. And it's not a whole lot of your time. It's like an hour per episode. So, yeah, that's my 2 cents. Go ahead, Josh.
Yeah, man, this show was made not just for people like me. It was made for all of you as well. If you ever played with a toy and have fond memories of playing with that toy, you need to watch this. This show is chock full of information, a lot of behind-the-scenes things, and fascinating tidbits. I never knew that the inspiration for the Barbie doll was based on a call girl. It was she was based on a call girl in a comic strip that had her own doll that men would proposition prostitutes with. That's the inspiration for the Barbie doll. And fascinating things. How different toy lines changed history, such as Star Wars. G.I. Joe, its placeholder in history. All the historical aspects are fascinating. But talking to the creators, the minds behind these, how it came to life, wonderful, wonderful stuff. I couldn't love this show more. I am super excited for the second half. I hope that this show gets another season and another beyond that, because there are lots of properties that have been untapped that can hold their own on an hour-long episode. That's my only critique of this show, is I wish the episodes were longer. Other than that, I don't have anything negative to say.
Or at least in parts. At least like some of them could be two-parters.
Yeah. You know, instead of being a 55, 60-minute episode, you know, two episodes of that length, you know. And there are some properties probably could warrant that. Others not so much. But, yeah, I love it. And I'm really excited for what the potential this series has in the future.
Cool. So guys, I mean, it's a massive thumbs up from both of us. Definitely go check it out. But guys, here's the funny part, and I'm sure you've heard us kind of accidentally say it from time to time. This is being recorded before the interview, and so what we're going to do right now is a transition where what I wanted to do was say, hey, Josh, take it away, but that seems weird now that I'm in the moment. So, Josh, if you would just like to have a quick music transition, and then we'll go right into it.
Hello.
Hi, I have Brian Volk-Weiss calling for Josh.
Okay, this is Josh.
All right, one moment.
Okay.
Brian, you're on with Josh, and I will grab Gregg. Right, Josh?
Hey, what's up, Josh?
Hey, how are you doing today, Mr. Volk-Weiss?
I'm good. Please, call me Brian.
Oh, well, thank you, Brian. Thank you.
How you doing? Where are you at? Where you live?
I am in Virginia, sir.
Where in Virginia? I love Virginia.
Southwestern Virginia, down near Kentucky and Tennessee.
Ah, very cool. I love Kentucky.
It's beautiful here, but there's not a lot here. But at least we have
Sounds like
scenery.
paradise. Sounds like paradise. I spent 19 minutes looking for a parking spot before lunch today, so I am envious
I have Gregg joining.
of what you said. What's up, Gregg?
How's it going?
Good. How you doing?
I'm great. I'm excited.
Let's have an interview.
Yeah, thank you so
right,
much.
Thank you guys. Thanks for being interested.
Oh, yeah. Well, go ahead, Greg.
Go ahead, Josh.
Okay. Yeah.
I just want to let you know. I want to let you know that we're still new in the podcast game. This is literally our 10th episode. I've been doing podcasting for about 10 years now. But for this show, this is our 10th episode. So, Josh, why don't you go ahead and start from where we left off on the half-parted episode, and then we'll just go right into it.
Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah, I'm very new to this, so it's been a fun experience for me. But yeah, I know you're probably a very busy man, Brian, and pressed for time, so I just want to say to all of our listeners, we have Mr. Brian Volk-Weiss on the call with us, and he is the creator of the Netflix show, The Toys That Made Us. And both Greg and I were fascinated with this docu-series. If you don't mind, Mr. Volk-Weiss, or Brian, I'm sorry, what was your inspiration for creating the show?
So, I mean, it was basically two passions of mine came together. One of which is toys. I love toys. I have been playing with and collecting toys for, pretty much my entire life, if not my whole life. So I've always been really into toys. Then the second thing is I've always been a history buff. My grandfather told me a lot of great stories of his life and growing up and everything, and World War II, and I just always loved history. And at some point, I realized that even though things like Optimus Prime and Cobra Commander and Star Wars figures and vehicles were beloved by billions of people and played with and changed people's lives and childhoods and whatnot, at some point I was like, there's 300 books about the War of 1812. And there isn't like a real official book about Transformers. Like, how did Optimus Prime become Optimus Prime? How did Snake Eyes become Snake Eyes? So that was really the thing where I'm like, how could something so big and so popular not have more coverage? And I'm a TV producer, so that's what I do. We started trying to sell a show about, at the time, the history of toys.
I was going to say, like, I personally really appreciate the show because I'm a huge video game fan, and there's already, like, 3 different documentaries about the history of video games, but this is the first one I ever saw about toys. And so, for me, like, I could tell, like, before we even got this interview going, I was like, you guys need to go watch the show. It's, like, really good. It's your history, and it's not just about the, like, glamorizing the toys. It's about, you know, teaching the history of everything. So, that's really cool to hear that that's where your inspiration came from. Josh, do you have another question? Because I'm drawing a blank.
Well, I was just going to say, you know, that was one of the things I was curious if there was, you know, exactly a specific moment where you thought, this would be a great TV show. And I really enjoy that. I like the fact because, you know, as you said, there are hundreds and hundreds of books about historical periods, specific events, but, you know, there is a large market for this very type of show, and I, for one, could not be any happier that you finally got to tap into it, and I'm sure that took quite a while.
Yeah, it took at least 6 or 7 years from the first time we started trying to sell it to the point where Netflix told us they were going to buy it. So, yeah, it took a long time. It's a quarter of my career.
Wow.
So I wanted to ask you a question that I'm really fascinated with is, how did you go about getting in contact with everyone involved with the different toy manufacturers and toy lines, even if they were retired? Like, how did that come about?
So once we got the greenlit, we immediately brought on the researchers. And some of the so that was the first thing. The second thing we did was we tried to get an expert for every toy. So, like, for Star Wars, for example, you know, we found, we didn't find him. He was actually a friend of mine for years before we got the green light, so I don't know why I said found. But for, like, Star Wars, there's a guy named Brian Stillman who made his own documentary about Star Wars toys called Plastic Galaxy.
Oh, I've seen that.
Yeah. So I saw that, like, 3 or 4 years ago, loved it, and became friends with him. And then as soon as we got the green light, I called him up, and I'm like, hey, dude, we got the green light. Do you want to be our Star Wars expert? And he was like, sure. So we did that with every toy. So we had at least one, sometimes 2 or 3 experts per toy. And then the experts, as well as our Facebook page, which also started very early, became huge resources for, if you're doing a show about Transformers, you got to talk to him, you got to talk to her, you got to go there, you got to go there. And then we started lining up the people that we felt we needed to get. Then we started talking to them, and most of them would then say, you know who you also need to talk to, and then it would start feeding itself. So it really started with the people that we wanted to interview, and then we built the show out around the stories they told.
So when you speak about the research team, how many hours of, you know, research go into each episode? I know there has to be a lot of countless hours, but travel, legwork, interviews.
Hundreds of hours. And, you know, we also pre-interview everybody. So by the time we, with our crew, are doing the official interview, we've already interviewed them over the phone or by Skype. So we interview at least everybody twice, but some people, there's a couple of people we interviewed. Then when we were doing other interviews, we learned more things, and we had to go back to, there's one guy, Marty Abrams, from Mego.
Yeah.
You know, we interviewed him three separate times, not including the pre-interview.
Oh. Okay.
So we actually interviewed him 4 times.
Yeah, he was in the G.I. Joe episode, wasn't he?
He's in the G.I. Joe. I don't know if he's in G.I. Joe off the top of my head, but he's definitely in Star Wars, and he's a huge part of the Star Trek episode, which is coming out later this year, in about 4 months.
Okay. Yeah, that's another thing that I wanted.
Very cool.
Go ahead, Greg.
Good. No, I was saying that I was going to ask you about that at the end of the episode. Is there like a tentative date for the next 4? But I wanted to get to that later, so Johnny kind of threw that out there. Josh, did you have another question?
Yeah, actually, when you were mentioning the interviews, and you mentioned that, sometimes like Marty Abrams, you had to go back and speak to him. When these interviewees, did they see the footage of the other interviews, or were they just, given the audio?
Never.
Okay. They were just asking follow-up questions. Yeah.
That's very unusual to show people other people's interviews. It happens every now and then, but we conducted over 300 interviews.
Wow.
We may have done that for like one small specific reason in one case once.
Okay, yeah. Because, there's generally, it seems like there's some little bit of lively disagreement about a few issues, specifically creator, who's responsible for creating this. I came up with this, I came up with that. No, I did. And especially in the He-Man and the Barbie episodes.
Yeah, I want to ask you, was there any eggshell walking when talking to anybody individual? You don't have to obviously say names. I'm just curious if there were any egos that you had to kind of tiptoe around.
We didn't really tiptoe around any interviews. There were things that we had to be sensitive about. There are a couple. I set out from the beginning to make a very positive show. I didn't want to make a show about gossip and just juicy, scandalous, Kardashian type crap.
Right.
It sometimes stuff came up that was very important and we couldn't avoid it, like in He-Man. But even there's another documentary out about He-Man that the entire core of that documentary is the fighting. So and I'm not saying that's wrong. It's fine. It's just not the show that we wanted to make. So, but that being said, there was definitely a couple people that are even in the first 4 episodes that were very polarizing to everybody else, and we definitely and aggressively downplayed that.
I wanted to commend you on that, on the fact that I liked the history. I wanted to know more about the history, and there was a little bit of drama, clearly, with some of the manufacturers, especially in the Barbie and He-Man episodes. And I like how when you told that stuff, it was in it doesn't matter because that's not what we're here for. Let's have some fun. And I loved that. I loved how you kind of steered around it. The joke in the He-Man one where everyone's like, I came up with this, well, I came up with that, and the joke that was made was hilarious to me. So, yeah, I wanted to commend you guys on that. That's why I was asking that question, was because it seemed like there was something, but you didn't want to pay attention to it. You wanted to get more into the history. So
we wanted to report accurately on the history, so we couldn't just not talk about it, but we didn't want that to be the central core of that episode. And listen, most of the TV shows that I've done, that's what you want. The funny thing is, we interviewed a couple people that broke down crying while we interviewed them, talking about how they were fired and, were treated like garbage after they were fired and everything. We literally got them sobbing their eyes out. And any other show I've ever produced, that's the stuff where you're like, woo, I got it. This is great. This is great TV. But this show, this show wasn't about that. You know, this show was about the toys that made us and the feeling and the nostalgia that we got from it. And, you know, you don't want to see 78-year-old men crying about getting fired in, you know, the 80s.
Yeah.
Yeah. Before Josh, I know Josh wants to ask another question, and I'm going to butt in real quick, Josh, just because I want to. There's a small one that you didn't write down that I really want to ask. Who came up with the idea for that theme song? Because that is the most catchiest thing ever to me.
I came up with it. The inspiration was even as a kid. I always found it really funny just how much detailed data was in, especially G.I. Joe, but also Transformers a little bit. So, like, the G.I. Joe theme song, I mean, it's literally all just data. It's like, G.I. Joe is the good guys, Cobra's the bad guys, sometimes they work with Destro, sometimes they don't, Cobra's terrorists, G.I. Joe are here, like, and I even remember as a little kid being like, boy, they're literally just spelling out the story. And Transformers is the same thing. So right from the beginning, I was like, I want the theme song to be kind of poking fun at the overly descriptive songs, you know, describing it. So that was the first inspiration. Then the second part of it was, I was like, we need something that is common with all toys. Like, what's the temple or the church or the mosque that everybody goes to? And I was like, and I'm embarrassed, it shouldn't have taken this long, but it was the toy store. So once we figured that out, then we put it all together. We wrote the song, which was co-written with a guy named Tom Stern, who also obviously worked on the show, and then we animated it. The license plate, I always like saying this, the license plate is my first car's license plate, and the girl in it is based on one of my best friends named Marisol. So there's two little inside scoops for you.
Oh, yeah, I noticed the license plate, and I was like, you know, vanity plates are a big thing in Virginia, and I was like, you know, his last name's Volk-Weiss. V-Y-S. I was like, I wonder if that's, you know, but if that was the actual license plate for their first car. So.
No, that was the first license plate completely randomly assigned to my first car. Yeah.
That's awesome. Well, that's a cool little touch.
Yeah, it's fun. It's fun when you get to do stupid stuff like that as a producer.
That's the point of having a show.
I think so. I agree with that for sure.
You know, speaking
Josh,
of
you have another question you want to throw there?
Yeah, I was actually going to say, speaking of you mentioning, you know, you were a producer, you actually worked for Comedy Dynamics, correct? And you guys with New Wave Entertainment?
Yeah.
And then you spun off and founded the Nacelle Company, correct?
Yeah, it's all very complicated. I've explained this 300 times to my wife. She don't get it, and that's not because she's stupid. It's just because it's complicated and ridiculous. But basically, New Wave became Nacelle. So Comedy Dynamics used to be owned by New Wave. Then when it became Nacelle, it was owned by Nacelle. So New Wave and Nacelle are basically the same thing, and Comedy Central has not changed in the slightest. Comedy Dynamics has not changed in the slightest. It's just owned by the same company whose name changed. See how crazy that sounds?
Yeah, that's crazy. It is. It really is. But, I mean, as a producer, though, you have gotten to do a lot of stand-up comedy specials as well on top of this show.
Yeah, and that was my entree to Netflix. So I was very lucky in that I knew a lot of the people in the right departments. And, you know, for a while, this was Brian's stupid toy show, or, there's Brian bringing up that toys thing again. And then I was very lucky. Someone took me seriously, told me some great parameters in which to follow, and then that's what we did.
Well, I think I'm glad that they came to their senses because the initial reaction seems to be incredibly positive for this show.
20 years I've been doing this. I've never seen anything like it. It is very heartwarming, to put it mildly.
I wanted to bring up real quick that I had a very visceral reaction watching specifically the Star Wars episode. Having a Star Wars tattoo and a ton of Star Wars toys, that episode connected to me. Have you had other people come to you telling you how just like a strong emotional visceral reaction to any of the episodes so far?
Oh, yeah. I mean, email, Facebook, Instagram. I mean, I hear from people literally every day. Sometimes they write to the show. Sometimes they write to me personally. It's funny, I didn't know on Instagram that people you're not friends with can send you letters that goes into like a completely separate inbox. I was not aware of that. And then literally just a couple weeks ago, I was looking at Instagram and I saw something. It was like 49. And I was like, what's that? And I clicked on it, and I had 49 people who I was not following or following me have been sending me all these letters. And I mean, I could read some of them to you, man. I mean, a couple of them made me like tear up. Actually, a lot of them have made me tear up. It's been really crazy in a good way. Very powerful.
That's outstanding.
That's got to be a dream come true to touch people like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, the good news and the bad news is Netflix, they let me make the show I wanted to make. They have a real artist-first mentality there, and we got notes, and they gave us a lot of great guidance, but they really, as they say, they gave us enough rope to hang ourselves, and you never know what people are going to think, just because I thought it was powerful seeing these two guys walking around Kroger headquarters 30 years later, that didn't mean it would be to other people, but it was. So I feel very lucky and blessed that what made me, I was literally crying watching that. I was standing behind the camera, I was tearing up. But I feel very lucky that, I wasn't crazy, that other people did too.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
The G.I. Joe episode got me.
Oh, wow, great.
Yeah, the G.I. Joe was my first love. I actually have a Cobra tattoo on my left forearm and the Rishikage I Ching symbol that Snake Eyes and Storm Shadow share on my right forearm. And
nice. Well,
my G.I. Joe collection's massive. But it's like...
You'll love this. You'll love this. I have decided that if we get picked up for a second season, my present to myself will be a G1 MOC Snake Eyes.
Oh, straight arm version,
wow.
I assume.
What's that?
Going for the straight arm version?
What? Yes,
Yeah.
Whatever was the first one to come out.
Yeah.
That of everything we've covered, of everything that I saw in making these first 8 episodes, the thing that I have fallen in love with was Snake Eyes. And I'm like, if we get a second season, I'm going to have me a G1 Snake Eyes.
Yeah, he was
off-topic question here. Well, I mean, it's on topic, but not during... Anyway. When you were interviewing different people about these toys, and you went to some of the people, like the guy that owns the biggest Star Wars collection in the world,
Steve Sansweet.
Did you ever get to... What's that?
I think that was Steve Sansweet, isn't it? At the Obi-Wan Ranch?
Correct.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Did you ever get to hold or touch any of these, like, priceless, super rare toys?
Yeah, man, I held a lot of crazy stuff. Yeah, I mean, Steve is very. I mean, there was we even put it in the episode, but Steve and he's right. They are toys and stuff, but I think Steve would have let us touch anything we wanted. I mean, he was really. I mean, there were a lot of times Steve was doing things where I'm like, whoa, 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 hey, be careful. Steve was great. He let us do anything really, but there were a lot of other things. You know, we went to Japan to the Takara headquarters and warehouses and stuff, and dude, I saw shit, man. Like all of the original prototypes are gone. But I saw the Polaroids for like the balsa wood work model of Optimus Prime, you know, the balsa wood, what would become Soundwave. They're Polaroids of them. It's all that's left. No one had seen them before, or at least in 30, 40 years. I mean, I literally was just sitting there, you know, covered in goosebumps, and and then, you know, so the answer to your question is, I'm sorry for rambling. The answer to your question is yes. I held and saw things I cannot believe. You know, I touched and put my fingers in the molds that made every single 2x4 Lego brick that was produced between, like, I think it was 1972 and 1988, which meant that when I was a kid, the Lego brick I was playing with, and the Lego, I don't know how old you guys were, but if you were around in the 80s, then the brick you played with and the brick I was playing with, they only had one mold back then. And, you know, I got to touch that mold and, you know, put my finger in it. I mean, it was crazy.
Yeah, I was around.
That's an experience you'll never forget.
That is amazing, and that's another thing that a lot of people don't realize is these molds, they don't hold up over time. I mean, they break eventually. They can they lose the molds. I know a lot of practices early on, like Hasbro when they had the G.I. Joe line, when they first re-released it, other outside countries would use molds. They would buy molds off of Hasbro when they were no longer producing figures from those molds. And then when they re-release figures later on, or people would call for, hey, re-release this, and it's like, we don't have the molds anymore, sorry. So for Lego to actually still have the molds that was used back in the 70s and 80s to produce bricks, that is pretty impressive.
Yeah, it was something to see, let alone touch.
Yeah, that is amazing. And, you know, just, you're seeing history, and a lot of people, they just don't think of, you know, oh, well, it's just a toy. Yeah, but look at what all went into these toys. That's the beauty of this show. And it's wonderful.
You're kind to say, man. Thank you.
What? Speaking of the show, what is the most challenging aspect of producing these episodes?
I mean, so far it's been just an abundance of, you know, some of these, you know, the Star Wars episode, the first cut was 2.5 hours, you know, and
wow.
Yes, 85% of what we cut should have been cut. But yeah, man, 15% of it was fucking painful. I mean, just painful cutting some of it. So, you know, we did this real deep dive into the artwork of the Star Wars, the vintage line, and how the artwork was done. We had about a 5.5-minute section about it, and it was fascinating and awesome. And the guy we interviewed was so charismatic and cool, and we had to cut it just because, you know, the episode was too long. So we've been putting stuff out on Facebook, so every week we put out another clip. Yeah, man, that was definitely the hardest. That was definitely the hardest thing.
Oh man, yeah, because a lot of that original artwork based on illustrations by Ralph McQuarrie. Whew. Yeah, I can definitely see how that would be a painful thing to have to let go of.
Yeah,
well, this is exactly. I was like, this is exactly why a show like this needs to exist, because, before watching it, I had no idea. None of that history was in my head.
Yeah.
And now it is. So, that's why I want other people to watch the show, too, because it's that same feeling I had with there was a documentary called Video Games the Movie, and it had, like, a big history about video games. And I thought it was a very fascinating look at the history of video games. This show does the same thing that does, but on a more individual level with different franchises. And when we recorded our review of it yesterday, which we're transparent with our listeners apparently, I had stated that I knew maybe 12% of the information in all 4 episodes, where Josh knew what, like you said, 97%?
Well, out of the G.I. Joe and the He-Man episode and the Star Wars episode, I knew a great majority of that, simply because, I've collected all 3 lines since their inception. I was born in 76.
Me too. Me too.
Awesome. So I lived through all
I'm
that.
the young one here. I was born in 83.
There you go.
Yeah, I always joke with Greg. It's like, I remember seeing Jedi in the theaters, and he's like...
That's the only one I remember seeing in the theaters. I don't remember seeing Star Wars or Empire in the theaters, but I know I did.
I vaguely have, 2 brief images of me seeing Empire. I can, there's flashes of it in my mind, but that's, I do remember Jedi very well. But, yeah.
I vividly remember seeing Jedi.
Mm-hmm. But growing up and collecting, I've never stopped collecting. And I always wanted to know more, and I was fascinated. And, I did know a lot of the facts that were told in these, but I didn't know anything, even though I have 2 younger sisters, and they had Barbies growing up. I didn't really know anything about Barbie, and I was fascinated by that episode. I never knew she had such a... how shall we say, lewd inspiration.
She did indeed.
Yeah. That was probably the episode I knew the very, very least about. It wasn't until that it hit the 90s Barbie stuff that I was like, oh, I remember that. Otherwise, I knew nothing. I was like, this is all new information to me. Real quick, I want to ask some personal questions here, Brian. Not too personal, obviously, but when you were a kid, what would you say was your favorite toy franchise, the toy that you played with the most?
I mean, definitely Star Wars.
Okay. All right. Any particular reason why, or was it just that popular at the time?
Star Wars changed my life. I always say, I'd probably be a dentist or a lawyer in New York instead of being a producer in L.A. if it wasn't for Star Wars. I was so young when I saw it. I thought it was real. My mom had to buy me a book about the making of Star Wars for me to understand that it wasn't, I didn't know this word, but I basically thought it was a documentary. So, it had such a powerful impact on my life. It does to this day. That was just because of the movie. Nothing could ever get ahead of it. And the toys were great.
I completely agree. I was going to say, I agree with how it affects, it affects my life to this day, because I have talked ad nauseum about Last Jedi to the point where people have asked me to shut up about it. So there's that. I'm trying to think of some other questions to ask about your history of toys. Because, growing up, since I grew up, 7 years, I was born 7 years after you guys. I grew up in the late 80s and early 90s. That was kind of my era. So, Ninja Turtles and Power Rangers were definitely, the most toys that I played with when I was very little. And it wasn't until the re-releases of Star Wars that I got into Star Wars. So my fascination is with, you were at a very ripe age when Star Wars had come out, so that makes perfect sense. But you guys also grew up, you were 10 in the mid-'80s, where, when He-Man and G.I. Joe were a huge thing. So I guess my question, the point that I'm trying to get at here is, fill me in on what it was like at that time to go into a toy store where it was kind of maybe a little different for me.
Oh man.
I mean, and just so you know, I apologize for this, but I was supposed to be off of this at 5:30. So if apologies, but this will have to be my last answer.
Okay, sorry.
I mean, so basically, this is the order of the greatest moments of my life. The birth of my children, of course, my wedding day. Then the first time that I had produced a movie, seeing it in a movie theater. So, kids, wedding, movie in a movie theater that I produced. And then number 4, greatest moment of my life, was when I was a little kid. I was in something called a KB toy store that doesn't exist anymore. That used to be huge in New England. And we were looking for the for the Luke Return of the Jedi figure, the all-black green lightsaber. And the entire right wall of KB, I mean probably 200 feet long, was covered in Star Wars toys. And my mom started on the far right, I started on the far left, and we were getting closer and closer, and I thought, they don't have it. And then I remember I'm sitting there staring forward, tearing through them, and I hear my mom say, "Brian?" And I turn, and she was holding it.
Oh,
and that,
man.
like I said, other than my kids, my wedding, and seeing my name, on a 70-foot screen, that's the 4th best moment of my life. So if that doesn't answer your question, I don't know what does.
That's
that
amazing.
That absolutely does. That was awesome.
That is an amazing memory. And yeah, Greg, you don't know, toy aisles today, and even in the 90s, are nothing compared to like back in the early 80s.
Oh, I don't doubt it. I don't doubt it. All right, so Brian, so that's going to be it for you, I guess.
Yeah, sorry. I thought they had told you ahead of time. I only had half an hour, so I'm sorry about that.
Oh, no need to apologize at all.
Our show goes about an hour anyway, so this worked out really well.
Yeah, we are just incredibly
But thank you
grateful.
so much.
Thank you, guys. I mean, again, you're grateful. I'm grateful. Thanks for caring about this.
Yeah, definitely.
Oh, absolutely. We're stoked for the next 4 episodes.
Yeah, and hopefully,
Thank you.
Hopefully
let me know
you'll
what
get
you
a
think.
season 2.
God willing.
I hope so. But Brian, thank you so much for agreeing to give us the interview, coming on and chatting with us. It's been a pleasure and an honor. And I hope you have a wonderful evening, and hope for more of this wonderful show.
The pleasure was all mine, and thank you, gentlemen. Have a good night.
Thanks, you too. Goodbye.
Bye.
Guys, I can't believe that interview. That was so good. Again,
Wow.
A massive thank you to Brian for allowing us to have that interview with you. We did go a little bit over his time. We honestly didn't know we had only 30 minutes, but we got 30 minutes of good content, so I'm extremely happy.
That story he told about being 7 years old in KB Toys with his mother, searching for that Return of the Jedi Luke Skywalker. And that, I was sitting there listening to him tell that story, and I had this big shit-eating grin on my face the entire time. And I can relate to that. It's just so much, so many memories.
Yeah, for me, a toy store was Toys R Us. We did have a KB, but KB felt that way. Like, KB definitely felt the way that, like, I was like, oh my god, I want to search every aisle, yada yada yada. But I never truly had that moment. I remember when Space Jam was a big thing, and I always was looking for the pieces that I didn't have. But I don't think I ever, like, the only moment I can think of that, like, I'll remember for the rest of my life was Mario 3 had just come out, and I told my mom about it. She was like, all right, let's go get it. And so, like, the family gets in the minivan. We head to Toys R Us, which was, like, I'd say a solid, like, 45 minutes from our house. Or at least it felt that way as a kid. I don't know. But it was raining, and I watched her run into Toys R Us and then run out of Toys R Us about 20 minutes later with a copy of Mario 3 just for me. So, like...
That's awesome.
Yeah, that's something I'll never forget. But, you know, the way that toy stores were in the 90s and even today, they're nothing like they were in the 80s, because it's something this documentary talks about, something that I kind of wanted to get more into him with, but in the 80s, toys were a much bigger commodity than they are now. Like,
they were marketed a different way as well, too.
Yes.
You know, they, like the He-Man episode, they talk about how they had to pitch, this is our new line, this is what we're offering, you know, and it was up to retailers to say, okay, we'll go with this, or we want this, but we don't want that. That's one reason why you don't see big play sets like the G.I. Joe USS Flag anymore, is because retailers, the shelf space, it takes up so much shelf space. That's why Lego, when you see Lego, you see a whole wall of Lego. That's because Lego has a contract. They're like, if you're going to carry any of our stuff, you have to carry so much of our stuff.
Right.
That's why you have the big $100, $200 sets that are on the bigger boxes on the bottom, and on all the little smaller sets, you know, towards the top. But yeah, shelf space today, that's why a lot of toy companies don't make big play sets, because one, kids aren't into toys like they used to be. They just, not the same type of toys, not big play sets. The smaller play sets, yes, like Madison, you know, she loves Shopkins. Shopkins play sets are very small. They don't take up a lot of space. You know, like the base of one is maybe the size of a standard textbook, you know, in the size that it takes up, versus my Terradrome that's 2.5 feet across and about 1.5 feet tall. You know, it's a big difference in space. But we used to have a toy store in our region called Hills. And one of my most favorite memories ever was going into Hills. This is about 1981, 1982. And my grandfather, he hadn't passed away yet. When I would go to see my grandparents in Tennessee every other weekend, every Sunday morning, my grandfather would take me to Hills. And I remember going in, and this is before Return of the Jedi, so it's got to be 81, 82. They had this big table set up in the middle of an aisle at the end of the toy aisle, and they had this giant diorama reconstructing the Battle of Hoth.
That's awesome.
Like, opened up toys, and they had a bunch of, like, you know, white fabric and cotton balls to recreate the snowfields, and they had little, you know, things from their craft department, and they would just have all of the toys from the line. They had an AT-AT walker, and they had the little AT-ST walkers, and they had the little Hoth laser turrets, and all the Hoth play sets, all the soldiers, snow speeders, and they had everything set up in like this big 6 foot by 4 foot table diorama, and they had it encased in plastic. And it was just so cool to go in there and just look at it. It's like, oh wow, you know. And then you'd run over to the aisle to see if they had those carded figures hanging, and it's like he was saying, like Brian was saying in his story about KB, just one end of the aisle to the other, like 60 feet, nothing but figures hanging, you know, like 10 rows tall, you know, all the way down the aisle. It was amazing. To get this interview with him and to, you know, have memories like that, this was a lot of fun, and I'm truly grateful that he granted us this interview. It's a big win for All Queued Up, and it's something that I know I am personally super proud of.
Yeah, I was like, you should be the most proud of anybody in this situation, because had you not taken the chance and gone and did something that maybe was a little out of your comfort zone, we wouldn't have had that interview. So I thank you, Josh, like, directly.
Well, in turn, I got to thank you for, asking me to be your co-host a few weeks back. So, it's all good. I'm happy for us right now. I really am.
Yeah, no, this was awesome. I again enjoyed the hell out of that interview, and I hope that we actually get to speak to him again, maybe after the second part of season 1 comes out. We'll see.
Or if they have a season 2, maybe we'll get to talk to him about that. Who knows? Who knows what the future holds? But
at this point, though, we need to end the show.
yeah. This episode's going to be a little long, but
not too much longer. It might be about the same length as the last episode, so there's that. But again, guys, so next week's episode, or not next week, I'm sorry, the next episode is going to be on Altered Carbon, which is a brand new show that actually releases today, if you're listening to it on this podcast on release day. But the other show that was requested by Anthony of Mission Star Podcast, the guy who hosted, or the guy who runs the channel that hosted this podcast originally, suggested we watch Devilman Crybaby. So we're going to watch that in its entirety. So guys, go watch those 2 shows, and then join us on our next episode. It should be a good time. Josh, where can they find you on the internet?
They can find me on Twitter at Ensabanur1976. That is ENSABAHNUR1976. And I do the occasional stream on Twitch at twitch.tv/Ensabanur76. So they can find me there. Sometimes I'll be building a model. Sometimes I'll be painting a miniature. Sometimes I'll be playing some video games. And no set schedule. So you got to follow me on Twitter to know when I'm streaming. But also, before we go, I do just want to say, this was made possible just because of the network connections I've made, and had I not heard Bryan on the Toy Detox podcast and reached out to Tyler, the collector from the Toy Detox podcast, I wouldn't have known what to do to get in touch with Bryan to set this interview up. So a big shout out to Tyler, big thanks especially to him.
That's what I wanted you to say. That's why I was like, also. So yeah, thank you to those guys. I need to actually start listening to their podcast. I listened to the episode they had with Bryan, and I really enjoyed it. So I need to go back and listen to it a little bit more.
Mickey, the well-dressed nerd, and Tyler, the collector. They're a couple of entertaining cats. They're part of the Cool Table Network. I will shout them all out too, but you'll. Hey, I got to. I love them.
It'd be. You know what? It'd be awesome if we could have them on our show. I'm just saying.
You never know.
You never know. You never know. All right, guys. That's going to be it. You can follow me on Twitter at ChubRockGeek. That's where I do most of my stuff. You can also come join me on Mission Star Podcast, various shows that I'm on. Sunday night where I do the video game news podcast, and Thursday night when I do the Let's Play What's on Tap with Anthony. Also, Anthony and I are planning a Dragon Ball Fighters tournament sort of thing on Tuesday nights. So if any of that sounds like something you're interested in, definitely come check that out at twitch.tv/MissionStarP. But guys, that's where we're going to end it. Go watch Altered Carbon and Devilman Crybaby and join us next week. Everyone have a good time. Good time. What is wrong with me? Guys, have a good night, day. What am I doing? What was my outro? Why am I drawing a blank here? This is a hilarious ending.
But you know what? I just like to say, take care, everybody.